Where is AI genuinely changing finance today, in your view?
Everywhere is the short answer, but it doesn't mean you don't need humans.
In your view, how will AI reshape the opportunities for early career professionals?
We know from the data that tech jobs, coding jobs, computer engineering jobs in general have been hurt by AI. We're still going to need people who can communicate really, really well with other humans, whether that's in person or in writing. It's kind of interesting. It's sort of like revenge of the liberal arts with this technology coming into play. In general, I think ideally you want to be left and right-brained.
The paramount skill is still critical thinking.
If you want to be successful in an AI world and have great critical thinking skills, one way you get them is
Don't take the liberal arts for granted. In this episode of Searching Smarter, I sit down with Rebecca Patterson, formerly the Chief Investment Strategist at Bridgewater. And we discuss the importance of balancing the soft skills like critical thinking, communication, and reading with becoming fluent in the world of AI. Rebecca puts her CIO hat on to discuss the global markets and gives her advice to undergraduates and early career professionals on how she would shape a young career today. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you for being here. Very nice to see you.
You too. Good to be here.
There's no point in beating around the bush. I think we go straight for it. Where is AI genuinely changing finance today, in your view?
Everywhere is the short answer. AI is changing finance in pretty much any dimension you can think of, whether we're talking about customer service, internal analytics, external analytics, risk management, marketing, new client acquisition, research, trading. I mean, there are applications for AI in all of these and other functionalities within financial institutions. The amount of efficiency these firms are going to get in the coming years, I think, is really exciting. And I've never seen anything like it in my career, but it doesn't mean you don't need humans. I don't think we're all going to become unnecessary, right? You know, most clients, I don't care what kind of firm you work at the end of the day, they want to know they can speak to another human. They want to know that there's human judgment involved in whatever's happening. And with a lot of the applications I just rattled off, of course, you need humans in the loop.
Is there anywhere where the industry you think is actually going a little bit too far overboard or getting ahead of itself on the AI front where, you know, maybe they should pull back and think, you know what, there should be a little bit more human involvement here?
Yeah. I mean, certainly we're seeing huge investments across the financial industry in AI because they all appreciate that this can increase efficiency and profitability. And especially if you're a publicly listed firm, that helps your share price. It makes your board and shareholders happy. But I get your point. And I think there are some areas where I don't know if the firms are getting ahead of themselves or the narrative is getting ahead of the firms. But let me just give you a couple examples.
Sure.
You know, Mercer came out with a survey earlier this year. They interviewed 131 asset managers, and they found that more than half have integrated AI into at least one major investment process. They found that over 90% plan to do so over the next year, but only 6% of the asset managers who responded to this survey said they're actually using AI today for decision making. So it's there, but it's kind of in the works, right? I think there's some other areas. A friend of mine at a large investment bank said that the firm is putting a ton of money in AI, and then the different businesses and teams know how they're supposed to integrate it, but they all have day jobs. They're not getting all these new employees to help integrate stuff. And so people are trying to do the integration when they can, and that's often evenings and weekends. And because of that, the integration is happening more slowly. I think that's a case of maybe the firms getting ahead of themselves a bit. And then maybe just one other quick example. The person was sharing with me that the firm has this amazing proprietary data, right? And that is the bread and butter of AI. If you have great data you can analyze and get insights from, it can be a differentiator for your firm. But the people working at the company weren't necessarily AI experts. And so they knew they had a gold mine there, but they didn't know how to monetize it. And so again, it's the narrative suggests that these things are already way down the tracks. And I think in a lot of cases, you know, the train's left the station, but it's not that far down the tracks yet.
I read something recently where, you know, as you rightly point out, right? Everything with regards to AI, it's not meant to completely replace, and we'll get to that in a little bit as well. It's really all augmentation if used properly and in the best intentions of where the use cases are. However, I read something that the engineers are working more and working longer to make sure that these LLMs and everything that's in production is working properly, because the humans are trying to keep up in real time with the AI. So, I found that fascinating because it's supposed to be, in some cases, almost a set it and forget it, right? You put the AI in place and it should do the work you're expecting it to. But now, because there's so much going on, the humans need to monitor it. And this is 4 a.m. on a Friday, 4 a.m. on a Saturday, 11 p.m. on a Sunday. And it's like, no, I was supposed to be able to just put it in place and then relax and go do something else. But now I have to keep up with it. So I thought that was a pretty interesting read as well.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. And it makes sense to me, right? Anytime you roll out some new major technology, you're going to have growing pains. Things don't work exactly the way you think. Gosh, can you even imagine today the cybersecurity you need to do, not just on the LLM you use, but on its suppliers and its suppliers. So there's a lot of cyber work that has to be done. So there's a lot of maintenance and oversight. And so I can imagine, especially as we go through the train leaving the station phase of this, that it actually creates a lot of new work that hadn't existed before. AI to me is like a great call option. You make this investment and you're hoping for this hockey stick return, but you don't know if you're going to get it.
So I want to use that to pivot our conversation just a little bit and allow us to focus on a particular demographic to start. In your view, how will AI reshape the opportunities for undergraduates and early career professionals, whether it is through, the augmentation that we've discussed, or how they might be using it in your roles? Kind of two things we've touched on so far.
I think for recently graduated professionals, obviously it's going to depend on the role, but maybe I can give a few, I think, pretty interesting statistics here to set the table. We know from the data that tech jobs, coding jobs, computer engineering jobs in general have been hurt by AI. And that includes tech jobs within financial firms, notwithstanding the example you just gave that they need people to help integrate it. Net, you're still losing tech jobs in the United States right now. And Challenger and Gray, which tracks announced layoffs, its last report for the month of June just came out, and it showed for the first half of this year, for 2026, nearly a third of all announced layoffs were in technology. So that was about 140,000 jobs. Now, that doesn't tell you if they're new grads. They could be people, throughout their career. But it does tell you there is this concentration as LLMs can actually do the coding themselves. You don't need those people as much. And I'm sure it's capturing a lot of those new grads. So that would be one statistic, which I think is pretty striking. But the other one, which kind of goes the other way, which is more about new professionals. So the New York Federal Reserve did a really good research report that they published recently, trying to understand why the younger cohorts unemployment rate is going up. Is AI behind it? Is something else behind it? And so they were able to get some micro data and actually look at the different jobs by different age segments. They found that since the pandemic, with remote work, companies have become more reluctant to hire a lot of young professionals because it's hard to get people in the office as much as they need to train them and mentor them. And so they're still hiring young people. They're just not hiring as many. And so the Fed found that this thing, the remote work challenge for companies, was actually a bigger deal than AI. And I wrote it down for myself because I knew I'd never remember the number. The Fed estimates that remote work explains 64% of the recent increase in the unemployment rate among young college graduates. So almost 2/3 is remote work. So, a third is everything else, which includes AI. So AI is affecting young grads, but it's not the big deal. I think the media sometimes makes it sound like it is the big deal. This is just one study, but I think it was a pretty thoughtful study, and it's suggesting that just getting people in the office to train them properly is the much bigger deal, which I thought was pretty interesting and I think underappreciated.
The COVID generation, that is results of a COVID generation.
Yeah.
Much more at play than, at an extreme fear mongering of tech is going to take your jobs. Which leads me to, do you think grads should be leaning in more on technology? Per your comment around the layoffs, right? Do they need to become more fluent with it to protect themselves and be, strive to be the top of their class with regards to usership? Or quite conversely, should it be the opposite? Should they not worry so much about the tech, given there are so many layoffs, and focus more on their soft skills and how they present themselves as professionals and young professionals? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, my view is going to be qualitative more than quantitative. I'm on the board of a grad school at Johns Hopkins. I'm involved with the University of Florida, where I got my undergraduate degree. I have one kid in college, one kid about to start college, and then I have lots of friends throughout the financial industry. So I get a lot of interesting data points about this topic from different places. And when I try to take all those data points and put it into a mosaic, I come away with two things. I think that young grads, people still in college, absolutely need to be fluent with AI. That doesn't mean they have to be coders. I mean, at this point, I can Claude code. If I can Claude code, anyone can Claude code. It's really that easy. So you don't have to be a coder, but you need to understand what AI can do and can't do for you. And
Yes.
So having a comfort with it, I think, is really important. So certainly they shouldn't shy away from it. But to your other point on those soft skills, 100% agreed. At the end of the day, I find when I'm using an LLM, whether it's ChatGPT, Claude Code, what have you, it's about the quality of the prompts. It's about understanding the responses I get back and say, oh, that's an interesting nugget. I want to dig deeper on that. Or that one looks wrong. And mistakes still happen, right? They're getting better every year, but mistakes still happen. And so if you are a younger person in college or just graduating, it's tricky. Like, I have the benefit of doing this for nearly 30 years. So I have lots of experience and lots of, time behind me to give me that context. Someone out of college, how do they get it? So I think that reading as much as you can, which sadly is becoming a lost art in the United States, understanding current events, just doing whatever you need to do to get the context around whatever your role is, so you can use AI in the best possible way for, again, whatever the role is. And then again, the soft skills. So that would be critical thinking and creative critical thinking. And the other one, and this sounds so cliched, but the people skills, right? At the end of the day, we're still going to need people who can communicate really, really well with other humans, whether that's in person or in writing. It's kind of interesting. It's sort of like revenge of the liberal arts with this technology coming into play.
Right up my alley. You're speaking to a political science major and minor in a foreign language. So as much as it is outside my comfort zone to think on my front foot and I work in recruitment, I work in sales, so I am in people business, right? It is very much, it's an overt effort, concerted effort for somebody like me to use an agent to help support my daily work, or to Claude Code to help me get certain results, right? That said, I kind of naturally, people like myself, we tend to naturally lean into those soft skills. Liberal arts, shout out to Dickinson College, my 2,400 kids where I went to school. If you were graduating today, would you lean in on that? Would you lean into, the revenge of the liberal arts? Would you think of more of a philosophical or liberal arts style degree, or would you go more into the hard sciences because of, the importance, fluency of technology and quantitative, abilities?
Again, I think it's going to depend on the role, but in general, I think ideally you want to be left and right brained in the world we're going into, right? Someone who is fluent with AI, maybe has a physics background, but also is a good communicator. That person's golden. There are going to be lots of opportunities. But someone who studies economics, and great, now a lot of data analysis, research analysis can be done with AI, but maybe that person has also studied history and behavioral sciences, philosophy, and is fluent with AI. That's going to be the person who gets that junior research job because they can do the creative critical thinking and have enough of that economics background, quantitative background to do the role. So I think you really do want to do both. But compared to, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe, where it was just code, right? I thought if my kids weren't on the robotics team and weren't in coding camp every summer, I was going to fail them as a parent. I don't think that's the case anymore at all. You need the fluency, but having all your eggs in that basket today is probably a mistake.
And that's been pretty consistent with what prior guests on this podcast have said as well. He wasn't a guest, but Jamie Dimon has said the same thing, right? The skill that he's looking for the most these days, or that he thinks is the paramount skill, is still critical thinking. So yeah, absolutely. And to kind of continue, this thought process and conversation topic that we're on now, but a little bit more specifically, you've mentioned the investment approach and the ability to present, and what, things like equity research and roles in markets research, how that exists in a world today. How will AI alter investment research or idea generation and potentially even decision making? Do you think that there's a world in which we're relying heavily on the AI to make the decisions for us? Or is this a perfect example where that presentation and communication and creative solution and critical thinking exists to drive the decisions? But again, ultimately, it is going to be left up to the humans for that executive, final decision making.
Yeah, I think for protecting the firm for legal reasons, at least for the foreseeable future, decision making is going to come down to a human in every case for a major firm. That said, AI can get you to those decisions a lot faster in a lot of cases. And I think for, the roles of the future, you're going to be limited only by your ability to use AI and your creativity and critical thinking skills. So
right.
I recently learned a friend of mine in the business had created a Kevin Warsh bot. And I was like, oh, I'm intrigued. What do you mean? And this gentleman had downloaded everything he could find that Kevin Warsh ever wrote, ever said, interviews he gave, things that were written about Kevin Warsh, his biography, his childhood, blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
Downloaded it all and then instructed the LLM, pretend you're Kevin Warsh. And then now any incoming data every single day, financial market conditions every single day goes in, and the Kevin Warsh bot is supposed to analyze them, and you get an idea of whether or not he's going to lean more hawkish or dovish, raise rates, cut rates, based on all that. What's interesting about it, I have no idea if it'll be any good, but what a great experiment, right? Because if it is good, if it actually is able to track Kevin Warsh's leanings on policy as the Fed chair, you could have an amazing data tool, right? You can look for anomalies in the market pricing versus your bot. Even if it doesn't work, you're probably going to get learnings out of it. Like, what does this bot miss? What does history miss about how someone's thinking in the role now? So I think it's just a wonderful example of how creative you can get with these things. Personally with AI, I like to use it in decision making as my devil's advocate. So if I'm leaning towards doing something one way or another, or analyzing a certain thing a certain way, I'll usually ask the AI, what am I missing? What am I doing wrong? What else should I be thinking about? And in a perfect world, you would hope your teammates and colleagues would do that for you. But we know human nature is such that not everyone is equally comfortable pushing back to a colleague or boss,
yes,
especially if they're telling them your idea is really dumb. So AI shouldn't be a substitute for that, but I think it's a wonderful complement for that. So in that sense, I do use it in decision making.
That's such an interesting, first of all, the Kevin Warsh bot is so fascinating to me.
I love it.
That's a tool to drive potential investment decisions. Do you go short? Do you go long based on his tendencies through your analysis? And similarly, to that second point that you just made, I think it takes a certain type of person, and this is maybe where, for the younger generation or early careers that's listening as well. The AI, as you say, it's a robot. It is naturally unbiased. And if you say, I need an unbiased view here, I need the other side of this argument, please poke holes in what I'm saying, then all you're doing through a curious mind is giving yourself the complete spectrum of outcomes, the complete spectrum of, analysis and what the decisions could be. So that's something that I hadn't thought of a ton recently, but I think that's a really great take of like, please help me not just confirm, am I correct, but poke holes and help me see everything that I want to do. So I love that point.
Thank you. Yeah, I think most LLMs in general to me are suck-ups. They tell you you're brilliant. They tell you, what a great idea, Rebecca. Thank you.
Every time it starts with that. You're really onto something there. Yeah, but I don't just want you to confirm it.
Yeah, the nice thing about the bots is you can actually program them or train them not to suck up, or in general to be a devil's advocate for you. So some people need the little ego boost. I'd say it's in your interest not to have that all the time.
I agree. And, as AI becomes ubiquitous, if it isn't already, are there other examples or other opportunities where you think human judgment remains the primary differentiator?
Yeah, look, we are moving very quickly, and at some point we will have generalized intelligence where the AI is good at every domain. But for now, at least, humans are much better still at connecting dots across different domains. So if I can see a geopolitical event in Iran, and I immediately say, oh, that's going to affect beef prices next year in the United States because we won't have the fertilizer to grow the crops that are used as feed for the cattle. And it takes about 12 months for that loop to happen. That's the sort of insight that you can get from experience, but the AI doesn't have yet. So connecting dots across domains, I think, is definitely one. Just looking at spillovers, I think human judgment, again, I sound like a broken record. It's always going to be needed when you're facing off with other humans. I just had my hip replaced. The tech is insane. My surgeon used a robot to assist him. There was tech used to make the perfect hip replacement. The surgery was like super fast, and I was cool with all that, but I wanted a human surgeon in the room overseeing it. I didn't want just a robot to do this without someone there. And I think that's true, again, in any industry today. Maybe that'll change over time as we get more used to AI, but for the foreseeable future, human in the loop feels much better to most of us.
I agree. And before we go any further, hip replacement going well, feeling fine.
Awesome. 2 weeks out, I'm already going out to dinner, getting my Starbucks. Life is good.
Great to hear. So you just alluded to something, right? You mentioned the war in Iran and how does that affect something, from a commodities perspective, stateside 12 months down the road. Given today's technological, which we've discussed, geopolitical, which we just discussed, and economic shifts, just generally, AI aside, what of those themes is most compelling to you? And maybe put on your former CIO hat, here to answer that question.
Yeah, I think, there's one that continues to jump out to me, and that is that we've transferred risk from the private sector to the public sector. And what I mean by that is when we think about 2008 and 9, what really triggered that crisis was corporate and household debt, household leverage. They had way too much debt versus their incomes. And when valuations started coming down on things like homes, et cetera, we had a big snowball effect. Since then, corporate and household leverage has remained relatively low. It's been creeping up, but it's still a lot better than it was in, say, 07, 08. But what we've seen instead is the leverage has transferred to governments. We now have Japan, the United States, France, the UK, others, where debt to GDP is at multi-decade, if not record highs. Budget deficits, given that we're not in a recession, are ridiculously large.
Yes.
And they keep spending money. Right? So historically, we talk about guns or butter. Right? You're spending on defense, And if you don't have a war, you're spending on domestic priorities, but you're picking one. Like that's what we all learned in economics. Today, we have guns and butter. So yes, I'm going to do tax cuts. I'm going to do subsidies for my domestic happy voters, and I'm going to increase defense spending. We can't afford it. That's the problem. And so what we're seeing is bond yields going up, particularly longer duration bond yields, 10-year, 30-year bond yields. And that has a price on the economy. It slows growth. So to me, that's the biggest kind of trend that, again, crosses domains, right? Because it's geopolitics. The geopolitics is national resiliency, making sure you have secure supply chains. That means more spending, right? The U.S. taking stakes in companies, making things at home more expensively. So it's inflation that pushes up yield. So it's geopolitics. It's the technology. All that AI CapEx is pushing up costs, pushing up yields. So all these things kind of are related. But to me, that's the big one. And it's underappreciated because, I mean, most people, let's be real, day to day don't say, oh, I wonder where the 10-year treasury yield is trading or the 30. Like most people don't care. But when I look at it and I see where it's been the last 20 years and I see where it is today, I'm saying, okay, at the margin, that's going to slow down our economy. Mortgages will be more expensive. Borrowing costs for companies are more expensive. Auto loans are more expensive. So it is something that I think is quite important and probably structural. So that's probably the one that jumps out to me the most.
What about prediction markets? They're different viewpoint from what you just answered, but prediction markets, market gamification, AI-driven financial products, all this. Where do you stand on that?
The free market capitalist in me says if someone has a great financial innovation and if the regulators and the government say it has sufficient consumer protections, then okay, it's innovation and people should be free to choose how they spend their money. We're not a nanny state. On the other hand, I get really nervous because what we're seeing in the data is that the house wins, right? The exchanges that offer the products, the companies that create the products, they're getting a revenue stream by the volume of trading. And then a tiny, tiny percentage of players, of participants will make money off these things. But the vast majority of people going there are losing money. It's basically you go to Vegas, the house wins. This is just the same thing. So if people find this a fun way to spend their time and they're in control of how much money they can afford to bet, great. My fear is that there is some subset of the population that becomes addicted, because it is addictive, that thinks this is a fast track way to retirement, which it is not, that confuses this with long-term investing. I think that's where the danger is. And I don't know how big a deal it is, but I worry about it because right now the regulatory guardrails there's some there, but they're not robust, in my opinion.
There is a massive conflation between, as you say, an interest in the prediction markets, thinking this is a career, this is, long-term investing, when really at its core it is kind of just gambling. And, we don't need to get into the ethics or we don't have time to get into the proper regulations around it. But I would ask, rhetorically, is this a career or is this just trying to take advantage, of the wider population who's just trying to gamble and see if they can strike lightning to prove to themselves that they'd like to be right? I think you and I can both agree that, this isn't necessarily, for the vast majority, this isn't the same thing as getting into a career in finance.
Correct. I think we are on the same page.
All right, we've talked about quite a bit. One of my last questions for you is, of what we've discussed, or maybe something that we haven't yet touched on today, are there any trends that are overhyped that you think about? And are there any that might be underestimated that we haven't already discussed? I know we've, as you say, the broken record of critical thinking, but is there anything else that's overhyped or underhyped?
I mean, no, I guess the predictions are overhyped. Everyone and their brother has a forecast, a confident forecast of how much productivity we'll get from AI, when we'll get it, who will benefit, who will lose. And I think the reality is none of us know with confidence. When you talk to the CEOs of the big hyperscalers and LLMs, they don't know. So I think that, again, they make for great headlines, but the reality is we don't know exactly how this is going to play out. I think we do, as a society, as a country, as a world, need to be looking at scenarios and planning for them appropriately and quickly. But I think this idea that no one will work and we're going to have great productivity and we won't have any inflation ever again, we might, but we don't know. So people just need to keep that one in perspective and not get too ideologue about it. And then I guess very, very different genre. But one thing that I think also gets overhyped is this idea of the US and China decoupling. I think we're seeing that despite efforts under both Biden and Trump to decouple at the margin, the global economy and global financial markets are still incredibly intertwined. I think Iran was a good example of that. And so supply chains are going to move. Investment flows will move. But at the end of the day, I don't think anyone is going to be a fortress onto themselves. I don't think it's possible in today's global economy. So there are movements going on and they will matter, but that's different than decoupling. So I would, again, especially for younger people, be careful when you use the word that you know exactly what you're saying and what you're not saying.
You could say that applies in more ways than one.
In lots of ways, yes. This is true. This is true.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate your perspective, and I love that we were able to venture out from not just modern technology, but how that applies to the world of investing and the global markets and all of it.
Just one last quick thought, especially for people younger in their career. I am amazed at the decline in reading in our country, which I think is happening with all age groups, but especially with younger people. And that's partly because it's faster and easier and sometimes more entertaining to watch a quick TikTok or YouTube video. And nothing wrong with YouTube videos here. However, if you want to be successful in an AI world and have great critical thinking skills, one way you get them is reading. And I mean books. And it could be fiction, nonfiction, but the act of reading affects how your brain develops in certain ways that actually develop those skills. So that would be a plea, frankly. It is pretty extraordinary to me how much that's changed in recent years, and it's not good. So I would just say, please, please, please go to Barnes & Noble, go on Amazon, go to your local library, whatever you fancy, but read.
I couldn't agree more. So thank you. And thank you for your insights. And thank you for your final plea, because I hope everyone listens to everything that you had to say today.
Oh, well, thank you. It was a great conversation. I appreciate you having me on.
That's all for today's episode of Searching Smarter. If you found this conversation valuable, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Until next time, keep searching smarter.